Today is Friday, December 15th, 2023, and you have found the Living Youth Podcast. My name is John Robinson, and I am here with my co-host, Mr. Wallace Smith. How are we doing today, Mr. Smith?
We are doing fantastic. End of the week. It's been a good week. Looking forward to the Sabbath, so been a good one. How about yours, Mr. Robinson? How you doing?
Pretty good. I had been good after the time change of getting to bed and getting up early, and we lost it a little bit this week. So I'm getting to bed too late, but if you stick to getting up early, then you slowly build up like a bit of a sleep debt. And
you're going to catch up this weekend?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
So you had something that this week kind of caught you out of nowhere and made you, I don't know what I would, quite reflective in some ways.
Far more than you would normally expect. That's right.
What happened this week, and what are we talking about?
Well, my kids and I the boys and I say kids, they're not really kids anymore, but still, the boys and I went to go see a movie. And, part of what we talk about on this podcast is we also address pop culture. We've talked about Will Smith slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars, and we have a biblical brain for everything. That's what we want. And so I thought, this is actually worth talking about. So today, I'll just set it up with our title. Today, we're going to talk about A Tale of Two Godzillas.
That sounds right up your alley.
Welcome back. And we are going to be talking about movies this time around, and we always want to be careful. We're not necessarily recommending that you go see these movies, and we're going to talk about all this stuff in a way that you don't have to see it to be able to understand what we're going to say. So I think this is a perfect time for Disclaimer Guy. Disclaimer Guy, could you come on out and give us some perspective?
Any discussion that follows should not be considered an endorsement of the subject of that discussion, unless the subject is the Bible. We endorse that big time.
Thank you, Disclaimer Guy. We greatly appreciate your service. We do talk about pop culture here. Ms. Robinson, the one pop culture thing that stands out that I tend to remember is we talked about Will Smith, slapping Chris Rock at the Oscars, but we've talked about other ones. What are some other ones?
We did Captain America.
Oh, we did talk about Captain America. Oh, we talked about the Johnny Depp Amber Heard divorce. But why do we talk about those things? Because pop culture, what's that short for? It's short for popular culture. Whether it's something we've actually seen ourselves or whether it's something we hear about, we always want to keep our Bible-based brain engaged. We don't give ourselves permission to think, oh, good, I can just kind of set the Bible on the shelf for a while and I can just indulge in this. There's nothing like that in the world. The Bible should always be informing our thinking. The Bible is God's mind in print, and that's what we're trying to reproduce in our own brain is God's own mind. So even with pop culture, and this was a pop culture event, it still is actually. I've been reading the Toho, which is the company that owns the Godzilla concept, has actually extended the North American run. They're seeing so much success with this most recent movie.
Yeah, I saw that too when I read about it. And have we named the title of the Godzilla movie?
Oh, we haven't actually. I should really do that because we're seeing two trailers out these days, one trailer and then one movie. The movie we're going to talk about, I'd say two franchises, we could say, but we're talking about one movie, Godzilla Minus One, the actual Japanese movie that is currently playing in North America. But we're going to be also the other Godzilla movies we'll be talking about are the current round of American Godzilla movies by the Legendary Movie Studios. Not legendary as an adjective, that's the name of the company. The one that recently had Godzilla vs. Kong, and now they've got trailers coming out for next year's Kong Godzilla team up against another monster. In fact, that actually impacted Godzilla Minus One. Godzilla has been a franchise for Japan. Toho, the company that created Godzilla, the first movie was in 1954. So next year, 2024, will have been 70 years of Godzilla movies. It is the Guinness Book of World Records longest running franchise, this Godzilla movie franchise. And next year is the 70th anniversary, and I think that was kind of the target year. However, they have a deal with the American studio to not release a Godzilla movie in the same year as the American movie. So as a result, since the Godzilla King Kong team up next year is coming out, they couldn't release this new Japanese Godzilla Minus One movie in that year, so they released it this year first. So it's been 69 years of Godzilla. Next year is going to be 70. I see your answer in the notes. Y'all don't know how we do our show prep, but Mr. Robinson, he actually does most of our show prep. So if you don't like the day's order, it's on me, because this is actually my topic. But that said, he does such a good job. And so I was working on notes, and I put this place that I wanted him to know I was planning on asking him this, because I grew up watching old cheesy Godzilla movies from the 60s and 70s. And here I had a question. I know you're younger than me, but did you ever watch any Godzilla movies when you were a kid? And I was, because we share Apple Notes, I was in my office and I saw that he was editing that, and it was something like, I have nothing to add. And it was just hilarious to see that note. But yeah, so you never saw any of these movies when you were younger, huh?
No, not at all. You know what? I don't know why this is the case, because I like plenty of action movies. In fact, you and I talked about how some of the afternoon cartoons after school, some of them were Japanese based, and we both share a couple that we liked.
And back then, I would say also the American culture, I feel like I need to say this because of modern culture, they were filtering a lot in America. These days, you can get stuff from Japan, and we are not endorsing Japanese cartoons, because they can bring stuff in today, and it's raunchy and it's terrible. But back then, and when we were young, America didn't allow stuff like that on screens for children, and so the stuff that we were exposed to was far tamer.
Because I think it applies a little bit, because part of what we're going to talk about here with Godzilla Minus One is it really goes to, it truly is rooted in the aftermath of World War II and how much it affected Japan.
Right.
And so the series that you and I watched, which was called Star Blazers in America, but in Japan it was Space Battleship Yamato, which was an actual battleship that fought in World War II and got sunk by the U.S. Navy. And so they had this futuristic vision of the world affected by radiation. Like that was really understandably in the Japanese culture after having two cities with atomic bombs.
Really the only two cities in the world that have been destroyed by nuclear weapons there in Japan.
So even that one had lots of themes of it. And it was like this, the Yamato was refitted so it could go into space, and they had to go. I won't get into the I know we know the details,
exactly,
but like this is a desperate mission to save humanity from radiation killing everybody on the planet. They were living underground because of the radiation on the surface. But like that's how deep in the psyche the World War II, the aftermath of World War II affected, which we're going to go into. I might mention one thing before we move on, and that I wanted to add to very briefly. We talk all the time. Our theme is viewing pop culture things, viewing everything through the prism of the Bible.
Yes.
And I would encourage younger listeners, that really is something you have to practice doing. Like it's a habit that has to be formed, because at first it's not obvious. Like you see something like the Johnny Depp Amber Heard thing, and it just looks like kind of a what did Mr. Bomer used to say, a thermonuclear train wreck. And so you think, well, who's right? And then how would you sort this out? And then how would you fix it? But you can, and a lot of stuff goes back to root causes, is how they got very far down this road. And so you do have to practice viewing things through the filter of the Bible to get things down. It's a practice. It's a habit that has to be formed. And that's all I would mention.
Oh, that is such a good point, Mr. Robinson. And it calls to mind what Paul writes in the book of Hebrews when he's talking. Now, he's talking about large things, but it actually is larger than just Bible things. He mentions in Hebrews chapter 5, when he's talking about how he wishes they were more mature spiritually, and how he says everyone who partakes, Hebrews 5 and verse 13, starting there, but verse 14 is the one we're going for. He says, for everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe. Verse 14, but solid food belongs to those who are of full age. And you might think, well, I'm young. I'm just a teenager. I'm a young adult. I'm not full age yet. Well, how do you get there? Because he says, that is, those who by reason of use have their senses exercised to discern both good and evil. Mm-hmm. And when you think of that as, I mean, I know you young guys out there doing push-ups and getting muscles, or some of you maybe wishing you did do push-ups as I say it, or whatever, regardless, you're thinking about building this life, and maybe you're studying for classes or something. But if you think of the Bible and Bible thinking as something you should also exercise in, you should try, and you should teach yourself, that you should adapt. And how do you do that? Well, by reading the Bible, but also taking time to talk to your parents, adults, people in the congregation that you know that are biblical thinkers, and how do they apply the Bible in their lives? Hopefully this podcast helped. But
if you're still out there listening to this podcast and you're thinking, well, how do I do it? And where would I start? I would just answer a simple question in most cases, like, how do we fix this? Like, how would we change this? How do we resolve this so this problem doesn't occur anymore? And then you'll find to do that, you kind of have to figure out what the root cause was. I found that in general, tell me if you agree with this, most things that we consider a negative consequence, a negative societal thing or a personal thing, you can almost always, if you track it back far enough, it comes back to a violation of one of the 10 Commandments.
Yeah, I remember when Janine and I were watching a particular sitcom way back in, I can't remember, the 90s, and shortly after, we kind of thought about it. So much of the drama or hilarity was actually, were there problems? It was usually because of what commandment they were currently breaking, of some sort.
Yes,
and that was, of course, the humorous version. But in general, yes, things boil down to sin or a misunderstanding of God's principles, or even someone who thinks they understand God's principles, like loving other people, but not understanding the nuances in the Bible of how do you act on love toward other people. So yeah, I would say so.
Okay. But to answer your question, to bring it back full circle, I never watched any of the Japanese Godzilla stuff and all the extension. I had zero interest in it, like not at all. If I saw it on a Sunday afternoon, I just
did not
just
interest
cruise
you.
past it. I did not.
Well, let me explain why that might be the case, because in my life it was the opposite. I was raised with probably more TV than I should have been. My mom kind of liked to turn on the TV, but she was, I'll give her that, she was a stay-at-home mom, and she probably also knew what I liked, and the ideas of big monsters clashing together and fighting when I was 5, 6, 7, that sounded fantastic. And the shows that I was first really exposed to, both on television, but then eventually on the drive-in theater, because a new one would come out from Japan, and they would, my mom and dad, my sister and me, we would go to the drive-in theater and go watch it. Were these Godzilla movies? Something I should say here at the very beginning, that the word Godzilla, let me go ahead and get this out of the way, because some people get bothered by that. So I want to skip straight to that, because I want to make sure you understand. Some people see the G-O-D at the beginning of Godzilla, and they're worried that it's blasphemous, like is some sort of god, this or that. And let me explain straight out, that's not the case. This is just a kind of transliteration. It's sort of an Anglicization of a Japanese word. The Japanese word is Gojira, so Godzilla, Gojira. And even that word, what does it mean? It doesn't have actually anything to do with God. It's the Japanese word for gorilla, which is actually gorira. That's the actual Japanese word. It's clearly taken from the word gorilla. And then it's the Japanese word for whale, which I had to write down, Kujira. So why? Because Godzilla was this massive, upright, walking creature from the sea. And so the guy that created him just made a portmanteau, which means a blending of two words together, the Japanese word for gorilla and for whale, like gorilla whale. So technically Godzilla kind of means gorilla whale.
I don't see the gorilla side of it.
Okay, here's why. Because he's supposed to be like a lizard, but he walks upright on two legs,
okay,
and he can use his arms. So it's not like quite like a lizard. And probably because I don't think there's any native gorillas to Japan. I think it's why it's a foreign word they've imported. I could be wrong. If you're Japanese out there listening, you can correct me. And if you think of them as large beasts, plus it could be this too. I didn't think about this, but because what was the only really big monster movie that was a huge deal leading up to this? It was King Kong. Right? King Kong predates Godzilla as a story a long time ago.
That's an American film?
And that's an American film, an American story, a large, giant gorilla. And so maybe that, I have no idea. You know what? I look forward in the second resurrection to meeting the the director here, maybe, and I'll ask him. But let me get that out of the way, because sometimes people are just worried about the word. I know that's kind of odd, but first, it's not a blasphemous word. It's just actually a Japanese word that's been imported here into English. But also, the movies I grew up on, they were goofy, they were corny. It was pretty ridiculous. It was guys in suits. It's just men in suits. Men. It's been called suitmation, like animation, claymation, and so they have actually, I've seen it in more than one reference, called this suitmation. Well, sometimes you could even see the zipper. My wife kind of warmed up to these movies when she'd see, I can see the zipper in that suit. It's clearly some guys that have put on a rubber suit and to look like a big giant monster, and the monsters can be kind of and just to kind of go at it, and just kind of fight each other. And as a kid, I just ate that up. Now the original story, the 1954 Godzilla, like you were saying, was clearly born out of these themes after World War II. In fact, you can see it as a picture of the nuclear power that the U.S. has introduced in the world. Not only is the monster's origin nuclear power, because guess what? There's not really big giant monsters in the world. So they kind of explain that, this is like some ancient dinosaur, and somehow the nuclear testing has mutated it and made it gigantic. But what does it represent in Tokyo in Japan? Here is a giant behemoth that comes into Japan from the sea, destroys its cities, and lays waste with its nuclear radioactive breath, everywhere. Very much a picture of how the war was ended, right? This vast power coming in from over the sea to drop these atomic bombs, and how they dealt with that. And in the 1954 film, which the special effects would look ridiculous today, but back then it was actually more about the story and more about the metaphor it even represented. And they actually included gruesome images that I don't think we did in the American version, where we stuck Raymond Burr, the American actor, in for extra scenes for Americans, but scenes of like radiation sickness and people suffering, from this attack. And the director there, Ishiro Honda, clearly made it as more of kind of a thoughtful horror movie. And the monster can't be stopped, which really we were not able to be stopped, right, in terms of America.
Yeah.
And so all the weapons, the planes, the tanks, which when you watch, it's just miniature stuff. They're like using little toys as they make the movie, but they can't stop this vast, powerful beast. Well, the thing is, it was a huge hit. In Japan, they loved this thing. It was a huge moneymaker, if I recall. It was a very successful film. And the Japanese, like all of us, they like money. And so the movie studio said, hey, we can do more with this. Well, that began a 70-year-long, it's coming to, series of Godzilla movies, some of them related to each other, some of them not related to each other, in which Godzilla has been interpreted and reinterpreted. And is, by the time the movies I was watching were the ones from the 60s and the 70s. And they even got downright silly in some ways. I mean, some of them actually, even when I started watching them with my sons, they were just too cringy to watch. It's like, oh man, okay, I can't watch this one. This is too much. Godzilla eventually has a kid, little baby Godzilla, Minya, and he tries to blow fire, but it's like little smoke, like little rings. And anyway, so they were good, but as a boy. And what boy doesn't like explosions and fantastic weapons, shooting lightning beams at a monster? I just ate that stuff up. And so that said, Godzilla, this is all of that. That's not the two approaches to Godzilla we're contrasting today. The title being A Tale of Two Godzillas, I'd like to contrast and think biblically about these two trends we have now. One, you have the Japanese one that just came out, and the Japanese one I'll talk a little more second, because that's the one I really want to focus on, what the director was thinking, who he is. But then it's the American Godzillas. Oh boy, when I say American Godzillas, I should qualify. I'm afraid someone will go search it and find the 1998 one with Matthew Broderick. That was considered, even in Godzilla circles, kind of an abomination, because let's just say America's first outing to make their own Godzilla was pretty terrible. It just kind of removed everything everybody was excited about Godzilla for. So
don't you think? Okay, if we can pause here for a moment. It makes perfect sense to me that America, at least in 1998, made a pretty terrible version of it, because we didn't make it with like the history.
Right.
Honda, I actually have some excerpts from when he from an article. And so, for example,
this is the first director.
The first director, Honda,
it.
right?
Yeah.
He was he was actually in a war prison in China when the war ended, and he'd heard of the bomb, but he hadn't seen it. So he went and toured the area, and the aftermath of it was just stunning to everybody, and it really hit him. And when America made it, like, we didn't get nuked, and it's a very different perspective. To the Japanese, you can understand when you understand the attitude they had going into World War II, how they fought World War II, and then in the aftermath, you can absolutely understand why they made a film like Godzilla.
Yeah.
In America, we just,
And that's, just so the listeners know, that's one of the things I'm excited about Mr. Robinson will provide that I don't, is Mr. Robinson actually has been, I wouldn't call you a history podcast junkie. I wouldn't put it that way.
Yeah,
but there's definitely some historical tales and such that have really captured your attention, and he has actually added to my understanding of these things. So I'm looking forward to coming to that.
The day after you went and saw the movie, and you were telling me about, like, what it's rooted in and what the lesson is and everything, and it immediately brought to mind the podcast series, which we'll take some excerpts from later. It's Dan Carlin. He's a pretty well-known historian in the podcast circles.
We quote him, I think, in the Germany booklet.
Yeah,
I think in our booklet about Germany and prophecy.
And he has a series that you can. So he like a lot of these guys, they weren't really getting properly compensated for their work, and so they moved a lot of stuff behind a paywall. But his Supernova in the East, it's a 6-part series, is on Apple Podcast. You can go find it if you want to. It's pretty clean, but the history is dark. And so
keep in mind he's talking about real things, and so history is not pretty.
So parents, you would have to evaluate whether or not, like, if I'm just thinking of somebody going out there and finding it to listen to it with their kids, and it's like,
you be careful.
Exactly.
So this is not an endorsement that anybody should listen to it, but for adults that are looking for a historian that really does a deep dive, but that includes some of the gritty ugliness that humans have done to each other. Mr. Robinson's told me some things he's heard from the podcast, like I think it's the one about East Germany, or maybe that's something else. But all I know is every once in a while, just so you know, Mr. Robinson, those thoughts still get to me. I mean, it's pretty horrific discussion.
Well, the series, and why I was actually pretty interested in your wanting to talk about this. I mean, it starts with, I think it's in the 1880s. I'm a little rusty on my time. Japan is still relatively feudal, and they're not industrialized. And Commodore Perry of the U.S. Black Fleet shows up and says, "Hey, guess what? You're open for business," because they were very internal at the time, and they weren't really very closed off. And the Japanese woke up and realized we are at risk of being colonized, like the British had colonized some of the other Asian countries, I think China as well, and they didn't want to be. And what they did over the next 40 years to rapidly industrialize their country, hats off to them. That it was remarkable. I'm talking about they're still farming with oxes and carts and everything, and by the 1920s they have epic battleships that they're floating around in, and they were ready to fight World War II.
That was amazing.
Well, I'll stop here, but they knew going into World War II fighting the U.S. that they were at a military disadvantage. The U.S. military overall was larger and more capable, even though theirs was very good. So their strategy to win was make America suffer so many losses they would give up, because their core belief was we can endure suffering much better than the Americans, and we'll just suffer more than they will, and that's how we're going to win World War II. So that kind of you can see how that goes into this movie.
Oh, it is. That is so going to tie in with what we have to say when we get to that. So, but before we get to those movies, because there is a lot of depth there, and that's part of what's shocking about this is so many people talking about a Godzilla movie as if there's some depth, because there is. But before that, Mr. Robinson, you may remember. Go back to, way back, I used to be a pastor in the field. I had the privilege of pastoring in Ohio, and I pastored the Cincinnati congregation there. If you're in Cincinnati, hello. It's good to, I was going to say good to see you. I can't see you. But we did a creation weekend. It was 2014, and we did a big weekend where we had people come in. Mr. Ames came as a guest speaker. You, Mr. Robinson, came as a guest speaker. And we talked about creation versus evolution. We went to the Creation Museum there to kind of talk about the pros and cons. And while you were in town, I think it was that weekend, your family, you and Mrs. Robinson and the girls, and our family, we went to go see a movie. Do you remember the movie, Mr. Robinson?
It's not ringing any bells. No, of course I do. The new big budget Godzilla had come out.
It's the first one. The first of these American
Yeah.
redos. Yeah.
It was Godzilla versus the Mutas, but like it wasn't bringing in King Kong and some of the other stuff yet.
Right.
I do remember, and so hopefully our audience will find this amusing. I know Mr. Smith did. So
I did.
I'm already on record of not being very knowledgeable about Godzilla.
You
because I
are.
didn't watch
No
it.
one's going to hold it against you.
So my favorite part of the movie, hands down, because I did not know this was coming.
Caught you by surprise.
Caught me by surprise. It was so cool. When Godzilla and the Mutas have been fighting for a while, and Godzilla is finally kind of like, you know what, I'm getting kind of tired of this, and so the way they film it is so well done, and his tail starts to light up and it starts working its way up, and I'm like, what is going on? And then when it gets to his head, he turns around and fires off this blue flame, blowtorch thing that doesn't even do it justice. It's like
kind
this
of breath
epic flame, right?
fire, right?
Yeah.
Like a dragon. Yeah.
And so I remember when I told you about that, you were like, "Yeah, that's his atomic breath." You didn't know about that? I had no idea. It was a unique thing for me because I didn't know about it. That the reveal was awesome.
The reveal was extremely well done, and I would contrast it with the Godzilla Minus One, because in both cases, when it's really revealed, it's very similar. In fact, it kind of gets already to an early comparison that kind of helps set the stage. But in the American version, when as a viewer, because you've kind of forgotten about it at this point, it's kind of just I hadn't thought about it. And then in the American movie, 2014, the new Legendary series, his tail starts glowing from the tip and it starts reaching up to his head, and you realize, oh, he's about to do the fire breath, and you're excited. You're excited for what's about to happen, and the effect is really very well done in that movie. Okay, there's a similar, and by the way, we should say this ahead of time. We're not even assuming you're going to see any of these movies, so we're not going to worry about spoilers or anything for the most part here. So just so you know, but they actually show this in the trailer to a certain extent. In the Godzilla Minus One movie, the same thing kind of happens. You have this kind of glowing that starts at the tip of the tail and it starts crawling up his back, but exactly the opposite feeling. Like you're suddenly concerned.
Right.
It's like this is going to be devastating,
right?
And you're worried about the people. You're actually concerned. In the American movie, it was a celebratory moment, and yet here in this movie, all of a sudden, it's the opposite. You're like, this is going to be devastating
because it's a proper movie, and it invested in the characters and built them up where you cared about them. So, and also, I know I'm kind of stepping on your lines a little here. In Godzilla Minus One, he's straight up a bad guy.
Yeah, he's straight up. It's interesting. The one thing where they overlap, but I would say that the Japanese movie, it's far more that. The one thing the Legendary series that started in 2014 did better than, especially 1998. 1998, that first outing, it seemed like they kind of thought, oh, what's fun about Godzilla? It's wondrous. He's a big giant lizard. Well, at least the Legendary series kind of understood, well, no, it's like a hurricane. It's like something that should inspire some level of awe, because here's this massive, potentially destructive thing. But he was still essentially a good guy. They try to write him like he's a good guy. And of course, the Japanese did as well. He went from 1954 being the destroyer of Japan to turning into Japan's savior and hero, fighting other monsters on behalf of Japan. And then, so the Legendary series, they kind of make him a giant animal, if you will, but who is sort of a good. He's a good force, but you got to wield it carefully, and I can respect that. But yeah, Godzilla Minus One, he's like tragedy upon tragedy. You have Japan has just ended the war, and they're devastated as a country. And then in that environment of devastation, as they're trying to pick themselves up and trying to understand how they should even see the world, then suddenly it adds. In fact, it's a weird title in English.
Okay,
Godzilla Minus One. Oh, really?
Yeah, I finally figured out what they should call it to properly convey the sense of it to an American audience, and they should call it Godzilla Less Than Zero.
Yeah, I could see that being more meaningful. I could, because that's what Godzilla Minus One. They explain it in the trailer. No, do they explain it? Yeah, they kind of do. The first trailer, it's in Japanese, but even though even the title in Japanese, they write in English, which I think is interesting. But it's I think they do. But it means World War II took Japan to zero. But then this new tragedy arrives in the form of what Godzilla represents, and that took them to -1.
Yeah.
So the math guy in me kind of likes that, but I agree, less than 0 would have actually been
Well,
a little
if
more
you
normal.
want a U.S. audience to understand like what the title is trying to convey, I think that would be a little better. But but that doesn't mean I don't like Godzilla -0, right? Minus one. Sorry.
Their posters actually have like a big G, which is interesting. Even in the Japanese, they use a big G because they seem to like English, but then they actually put a -1.0. That's like their thing.
Okay.
So yeah,
Okay.
they seem
That's
to like
cool.
that.
Okay.
But anyway, so in those American movies that I want to contrast to, they're popcorn entertainment. They're not meant to make you think profoundly. They do the kind of standard American thing of throwing in some things that could be considered profound-ish. They have little things they want to preach, whether it's about the environment or something. But honestly, they're not meant to be profound. In fact, one of the moments in the first of those, the 2014 one that you saw with my family also at the movie theater, was where the actor Ken Watanabe. They can't stop the monsters, Godzilla and the other two monsters, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And the camera slowly focuses on Ken Watanabe, and he finally just says, "Let them fight." Like that's and as a movie viewer, you realize, thank you. That's the whole reason we're there, is to see the monsters fight.
Maybe
That's what we're there for.
We don't know it, but he was internally pleading for the American directors to just let them fight.
Yeah, because that was one of the funny things about the reviews of that first movie was there's not enough monsters. We don't see the monsters enough. Well, they definitely made up for that in the ones that followed, because you had Godzilla King of the Monsters, then you had Godzilla versus Kong, and now there's a new one coming. Everything's been Marvelized, right? So you have to have a universe that has all these movies. So the one that's coming out next year is, I don't know how they pronounce it. It's like Godzilla X Kong, but it's both of them teamed up. But what do those represent? Well, a bunch of monsters fighting, and there are people. And I would say both the series that began in 2014, the American made, and this one focus on the people probably for about the same amount of time. Some of them like the Godzilla versus Kong one, and yet you don't really care about the people. If anything, you kind of wish the people would hurry up and get out of the way, because we're here to see monsters fighting each other. The characters have a drama behind them, and it would normally be a serious kind of drama of loss or divorce, but honestly, it's not really fleshed out, and you don't care. They're like props. They're props.
Right? Exactly. Okay.
Oh, and then one more about the American one. Oh, like the big. I would say the big scene they were gambling on people getting excited about in the Godzilla versus Kong movie, which came out around 2020. It was around the time with lockdowns and stuff. It was in fact, it was kind of credited for helping to save Hollywood theaters, because people kind of went to go see this giant lizard versus giant monkey movie. Was the Hong Kong fight, where Godzilla shows up to fight King Kong, or vice versa, actually, kind of, but in Hong Kong at night. And, there's buildings being destroyed right and left, and fire breath, and Godzilla's got an axe because he's one smart monkey, And anyway, it's all this stuff going on, and vast amounts of destruction of faceless people you'll never see because they're in skyscrapers or they're on the street where and honestly, you don't even think about them. It's kind of like it's the video gaming of violence, where you don't where all the faceless humans are just props. And then the people that have faces but no names are also props. And the people that do have names, they're the cutscenes between the action. You're not really invested in those people.
Well, do you remember? I think this was off of we have a TV series we both enjoyed, the Leverage. They make the point in it, and I think it's the one that features Hardison more, which is, when like 1 million people die, that's like too bad, but like when like one person is a victim, it's like a tragedy. It's like the idea that like when 1 million people die, it's kind of a faceless loss. You didn't know them anyway, but like if you zero in on one person or a group of people and details about them, and you become a bit invested in them, and something bad happens to them, then that's a tragedy. It is kind of an interesting thing.
Right. When it's a vast number of people, it's a statistic. Right, when it's one person, it's a tragedy. When it's a vast number of people, it's a statistic. And I would say that honestly, like in the American version, it's not even a statistic. I mean, you're actually not thinking of a lot of these people at all. And yet somehow in that one, the whole world is supposed to be at stake, right? It seems, because there's bad guys, you want to unleash a new weapon, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now that's the Americanization of this kind of, and I say Americanization, I shouldn't really do that. I mean, other cultures can be just as shallow with the things they put together. And also there's, okay, let's just jump right to it.
Okay.
For this Japanese release, Godzilla Minus One, it's different. And let me highlight. So the director here, and I don't know his name like I knew the other, is Takashi Yamakaze. And this is his second outing to make a Godzilla movie. And I am not at all interested in the last one. This more recent round of Godzilla movies is also kind of like an anthology. They all stand alone. They're not part of some vast connected universe. Though who knows? That's where so much money is. I wouldn't be surprised if they try to do that. And his last one was called Shin Godzilla, which I couldn't tell you what that means something in Japanese. But man, I was not interested in seeing that. I mean, it looks gross. It's meant to kind of be a return to kind of a horror sort of setting.
Okay.
And it really does look horrific. It looks gross. There's just disgusting elements to it that I'm just not going to see.
Mm-hmm.
It's hopefully a lesson out there to you, everyone. Just because you're a fan of something, you don't have to digest every part of it. I mean, you evaluate that. And if that's not worthwhile, don't go see it. I'm not saying there might not have been literary elements that were of quality, quote unquote, to it. I've read one review that said it was meant to be kind of a satirical look at Japanese government to a certain extent or something. But just because something has political commentary, that's not going to I'm not going to go look at something and befoul my eyes with things I don't want to see. So anyway, I'm not, this again, kind of like everything, we were talking about pop culture, we're not recommending it. But this movie was very different, and he's very much, he was the director, he was the writer. My understanding is he was deeply involved in the special effects. And when I say special effects, this movie was made for, I say $15 million, but the director tweeted that he wished he had $15 million to make the movie.
That's actually pretty remarkable.
It is I actually got more details. Do you know how much, my understanding is, how much Mr. Robert Downey Jr. was paid for the last Avengers movie, Avengers Endgame?
Okay, since it was no longer a gamble, because, the first Iron Man...
Oh, it was going to make a lot of money.
Yeah, right. So I could see him making... I'm going to undershoot this because I'm just trying to be honest about what I would think it would make, knowing that this is probably low. I would assume he would get at least $20 million.
Okay, that's not bad. That's a start. That was his upfront pay.
Okay.
So he, upfront... I think a lot of the other main characters were paid $15 million. He was paid up front $20 million, and that's just to have him show up. But part of his agreement was he would also, and I'm not knocking him for this, just so you know, he's actually quite a philanthropist, like real life philanthropist, instead of Tony Stark, whatever. So I'm not knocking him for this. This is American money for an American blockbuster that made $2.8+ billion, and he was a main draw, but he also worked out a deal for 8% of the profits.
Wow.
So
8%?
8% of the profit. They recognized they were going to make
incredible.
They were going to make oil tankers worth of piles of money, and he was a key part of it. And they did. They paid him for it.
$2.2 billion. Would 10% of that be $220 million?
Well, it wasn't profit. That's profit. And I don't know how they qualify profit these days. My understanding is for him that turned into around $55 million or something, but I'm not 100% sure. In fact, when I did look into these facts, it was some time ago, and it was using, I think I was using Bing's AI, but here's a qualification. I also used Bing's AI this morning to try to understand the list of the major characters in the Godzilla Minus One movie, and all of its answers were ridiculously wrong. It got names right completely terribly. It did not characterize any of those characters properly, even gave me a footnote to imdb.com, and yet utterly wrong. So AI still in the works.
Yep.
But anyway, going back to this movie, this particular movie, what the director sought to do was something different. And so with Godzilla Minus One, there's an element of realism to it. It brought home to me what it would have been like to be in the losing country of World War II. I mean, the country is devastated. The main character who you care about, that was the crazy thing. And I agree. I've seen more than one reviewer say this. it was a Godzilla movie in which he was clearly pivotal, and yet you could have removed him from the movie, replaced him with something else, and it still would have been a human story you were interested in.
You know, my brother-in-law, I mean, probably over 25 years ago, talked me into watching the German language version of Das Boot.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah.
I saw that with my dad when I was younger. Yeah.
So the reason I mention it is it's a submarine. It's a German submarine during World War II. Their harrowing experience. Somehow, beyond all odds, they managed to make it back to their German base. You know, World War II is kind of in the wrap-up phase. They finally make it home, which was an incredible feat, and then they get out of their boat and they're bombed by American bombers. Like I don't think they died, but when when it's over, my brother-in-law said, "Yep, when you lose the war, you make movies like that."
Oh, wow. Wow. Well, in this case, it does start in a sense in a very dismal way, and the main the main protagonist in this is a character named Shikishima, and it's at the end of the war. And when you first see it, the war's not quite over, but it's over. Japan is essentially lost, and the clock is just ticking. And he is a kamikaze pilot. So those who don't know, that's the pilots that essentially they flew to die. Their job was to fly their plane into boats, like living missiles.
And there were a lot that did that.
Oh yeah, and so he has a crisis of whether it's conscience, whether it's cowardice, because the movie does mention that his parents sent him a letter just promising that he'll come back alive, and he lands claiming plane problems on this little island. But as the main engineer notes, there's nothing wrong with this plane. Why are you here?
Well, I would also question if an element of, because you're like, it's probably a mix of things, and I know we're already going too deep. There was beginning to be within some in Japan at that time a questioning of like, why are we doing this? But the main drivers of Imperial Japan, it was unquestioned why they were doing it, and that they were going to go down with the ship, literally and figuratively.
Right. We will win, or there will be no Japan, because it could only be Imperial Japan.
So he might be one of those ones that also was sort of like, well, why are we doing this again?
Well, okay, it's interesting because they could set that up. Like one engineer on the island comes to him privately and says, "Hey, some of us agree with you. We don't understand why are we throwing lives away when it's clear we've lost? Mm-hmm. Why are we telling people go and die?" But that's not the character though. Which feel free. Yes.
So this might be a good time to inject a couple of historical quotes.
Oh, okay. Let me go ahead and say about the character. Then I'll get it out of the way so we can focus. The character does reveal then when there's an opportunity to kill this early version of Godzilla, when he's kind of a smaller dinosaur, if you will, when he's too afraid to pull the trigger. There's clearly fear is playing a role in his character, and so it's not, whether it's taking a principle stand or whether he's just afraid is kind of a mix. But regardless, what's your anecdote?
Okay, so this movie is set. Well, technically, the World War II is still going on. It's
at the very beginning,
end of it.
But it's like December of 1945. So
I have two quotes that I think are interesting because what this movie seems to, now I haven't seen the movie, but I watched a couple of reviews of it, and then in discussion with you, and then mixing with like what I'm aware of in actual history, and where this movie seems to be like part of the point that it's trying to make. You have to understand like this idea of Imperial Japan, and if there was so the emperor was like this divine being as they viewed it, over Imperial Japan. But Imperial Japan also sort of had its own life. It was almost like a god, and you were expected to serve it and sacrifice your life. Wow. And this was like the main guys in the military. So to support that, I was re-listening to the final podcast, and this was a little more aimed toward the Germans, but but he included the Japanese in this as well. So in January of 1945, the Germans in that month alone lost 450,000 soldiers, died.
Wow.
And so an aide to U.S. General Bradley, I believe it was, said reasonable people would have surrendered by now. And he was highlighting just how fanatical the Germans had a very similar kind of the Third Reich, and mindset. You were expected, And the Japanese, I would argue, even more so than the Germans, frankly. But then another quote from the podcast that just blew my mind is, this as the Americans got closer.
This is Dan Carlin, the historian?
This is Dan Carlin, as the U.S. Navy took island after island and got closer and closer to the Japanese mainland and was able to start bombing their cities. You would think, okay, we're getting our cities bombed. Might be time to start like negotiating or like. Well, part of the dilemma apparently was the call for unconditional surrender, and some wonder if it would have been better off if there were terms, like negotiation. But at any rate, the Japanese government had no intention of surrendering, and they said, or he said in the podcast, the Japanese people will get used to being bombed. Like that'd just be part of everyday life, is you deal with bombs.
Wow.
Just to highlight the fanaticism surrounding the Japanese mindset with many. And I know we're going to pivot there in a minute, but like part of what this movie does is like analyzes, was that a great idea?
It really does. It's fascinating because here you have this soldier who the pilot who survived, who doesn't die as a kamikaze pilot, and who ends up feeling, no one knows that except for this one engineer who's bitter about it, because then when he fails to do the thing that would have stopped the early, younger, not mutated Godzilla monster, then all the other engineers on the island end up dying in that particular case. And so the head engineer blames him. He said, you could have just pulled the trigger and killed this animal, So your main protagonist is plagued with a lot of guilt. The war is over and he has survived. He didn't do his duty. He did not throw his life, at the enemy. He didn't. Here all these engineers have died. They're not going to go home to their families,
right?
And yet here he is still alive. And then this head engineer, who knows? So you have a character who's very burdened, but it also makes it very real. Unlike so many of these movies, the character already you're hoping for him. You have hopes. You hope things go better. But then he goes back to Japan. And it's a part of Tokyo, and it has been bombed, and it is in terrible shape. And his neighbor is upset at him because she knew he was a kamikaze pilot, and how he's hero's home.
Okay,
your parents have died.
Yep.
All my children are all dead in the bombing, and you're alive.
Yeah. You shouldn't. Why are you standing here?
Exactly. Why are you here?
We can contrast that with an actual historical fact, which was there was a number of Japanese that continued to fight solo battles, like some on the Philippine Islands,
even after the war was over.
Well, right? After the war was over. So the one in particular, he fought until the 1970s. Okay,
wow.
And so they knew
wow.
the Filipinos knew for a while there was a Japanese army guy still running around, occasionally shooting people. And later, when they finally do talk him out, which was only when thankfully, his superior officer from the 1940s, when they dropped him off, was still alive. And he flew to the island and released him from duty.
Oh, that's amazing.
Okay. So in his mind, he was told to stay there on the island, do various guerrilla warfare things, and just, that's what you do until the war, we either win or lose the war. So what was happening was, they would drop newspapers and other things to try to show him, hey, the war is over, which he did not believe, and that here's a Japanese living in cities that have been fixed up and living a regular way of life. And he was sure that it was straight propaganda, because this goes back to the mindset.
Okay.
If the war was over and Japan lost, there would be no life back in Japan because everybody would be dead. That is his expectation.
Because they would have been willing to die, the last man, woman,
That's right.
and child.
Maybe this is a good time to bring in my other quote that I loved. Okay, so as early, it depends on, not everybody had agreement, but many in the Japanese Navy in the aftermath of the Battle of Guadalcanal, which was 1942, and if you're younger and you don't know, World War II was fought from late 1939 to 1945. So overall, a 6-year war. So 1942 is somewhat early in the battle, because like what Pearl Harbor was December 7th, 1941, or is it 42?
Pearl Harbor, 41.
41. Okay. So not much more than a year on, and some are like the Japanese had lost enough battle that the Japanese Navy, the collective of decision makers, had concluded that they were not going to win the war. So this is an actual quote from them. They were fairly public about it, and this was published in a book from their own writings.
Wow. Okay.
So here's what the Japanese Navy commanders said. They said, "We can no longer direct the war with any hope of success. The only course left is for Japan's 100 million people to sacrifice their lives by charging the enemy and making them lose their will to fight.
Wow.
So you can understand now your character how if he's back, like you shouldn't be back. You should have sacrificed yourself.
Well, yeah, you had mentioned the other day, we're talking that even like wives and mothers were taught have bamboo spears, to be stabbed. Like they were expecting everyone down to the children to be able to do these things.
It's almost like you go out for your daily Tai Chi exercise where you use your sharpened bamboo spear to potentially defend the island against the American army.
Right. So this woman who all the kids, there's like also no bad guys in this movie, which is kind of interesting. There really aren't. Like even this woman, she's so bitter, but all of them over the few years that follow, they grow, they overcome. But this guy, our protagonist, takes the longest, and so he ends up very quickly in all the rubble as he's trying to live in the little broken down hut that had been a home. He ends up with a found family. What does that mean? Well, regrettably, found family these days is part of the culture that frankly, your trans community is trying to communicate, your a drag queen community is trying to communicate, that you don't have to have a husband, wife, parents, children, just the people you find around you, and that becomes your family. You come to this family. Well, they do that because they have severed all God-intended ties to other people. Mm-hmm. And as a result, family can be, they don't have to be parents or children or anything. And honestly, there's a lot of perversity that's packed into that. If you haven't seen my telecast that came out recently on the war on normal, the war against normal, then take a look, because it's planned. That's what they want you to rethink relationships. Well, his found family, actually, it's very clear that the director still has in mind the traditional family, because it's very plain in multiple ways, because what he comes across in the marketplace is a woman with a baby, and she's running. They stop her, she's a thief or something. Well, she runs into him and he tries to stop her. He's like, oh, it's a bad person, I won't stop him. Well, then she kind of hands him the baby and she runs off, and he's like, oh, what in the world? So what does he do with this little baby? And it's interesting, like there's a point where he's waiting and waiting, thinking surely this woman's going to come back, and he kind of sets the baby down and thinks, well, I'm just going to have to walk off. But he can't. It's a baby. Mm-hmm. What can he do? He can't abandon this little baby. So he goes back and sits with it, and finally kind of starts walking back home with this baby. And when she sees him, she jumps out and says, it took you forever. And he's like, why didn't you come get this baby? She's like, why? They would have seen me if I'd have come back. Because that was after the war. Everybody's scrounging around. There's, some of them stealing what they need to survive. Well, she ends up tagging along, and they end up being together. And one thing I like about this is in the subtle ways they need to, they make it plain. They don't sleep together. Mm-hmm. They're not fornicating. Mm-hmm. They're just it's after the war, and there's a shelter there, and here's this baby that clearly needs to be cared for. The mean lady that attacked him, because of you, my children are dead, and all the rest. Well, she ends up, because they're young, she gives advice. She gives rice, and the young ones are very respectful toward her, for doing this and for being willing to help. And so before long, they've made this family, but not fully as it should be yet, because he's tortured by the memory of these men who didn't get to go back to their families. And why should he? Because he's loathing his life. Why should he have a family when they don't? He builds a relationship with these people on a boat where he's getting job because they need money to take care of the baby. And they easily fall into all the roles of a family. He's the moneymaker and the provider. She's caring for the baby while he's gone. When his friends come that he works with, she's serving all of them. And they essentially say, they assume that's his wife, and then when they find out it's not, say, why in the world not? Why? And he can't tell his secrets, so he won't explain. But the only time she even decides to get a job, and he's upset, and he says, well, don't I make enough? I mean, don't, and she's like, well, no, but if you're constantly taking care of me, you're never going to go find a wife somewhere, and I've got to learn to take care of myself. And it's really, because he also, so you saw he's starting to feel like he is taking care of someone, but like he doesn't have the right to do that, because he's not deserving of a family. And it actually puts, I would say, biblical masculine and feminine traits on display. Here you have a guy who does feel the calling to the masculine role to protect this family, to serve this family, to provide for this family. And you see her being called to this feminine role where, like, why does she even have this baby? Because she just couldn't, her family was destroyed as well in the bombing, the American bombing. And she she came across a baby, and how can she leave a baby there? Even though she has nothing to give, she's an adult at least. She has more than this baby, and so here she is trying to serve this infant, the maternal instincts, and then now they're this family, and so she's serving him. She's serving she's a helpmeet. She helps to make the home a better place. When his friends come to dine with them, she's serving them. And even when he's stricken by this essentially PTSD because of everything, and she finally just calls out to him like, let me help you bear your burden. Just you're clearly bearing something alone, and it's hard for you. Let me help you bear that. And he finally tells her all of the things about the people that died and how he was a kamikaze pilot, and it's just this support that a man needs with a wife. That sometimes, yeah, it's a hard burden, and you need them at least to sometimes just knowing that someone knows your burden, is helpful. Yeah. But honestly, it wasn't some kind of lesson about, the powerful independence of women, because she's clearly a strong woman. But how is that strength poured into supporting this larger unit that she's a part of? And again, no fornication. They literally imply in lots of ways that to show that no, they don't have that kind of relationship because they're not married. Mm-hmm. And also, even in the friends, I'm going to go on a little bit, but the friends to me exemplify what the Bible expects of friends. We've talked about the proverb before, but Proverbs 27 and verse 6. Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful. When these guys in multiple places, when they find out that he hasn't married her, they highlight that's what you should do. You owe that to her at this point. You're taking care of her. You need to do right in this way. And they our society, it seems like in America, we prioritize happiness as if happiness is the ultimate goal. And here it's not about, hey, you'll be happier if you marry and feel, even though you find out he actually would be, but it's more like you have an obligation.
Duty, yeah.
This family, this woman and this child depend on you now. And like later, there's a point in the movie where one of the characters suspects that Shikishima, the kamikaze pilot protagonist, that he's kind of preparing to kill himself to help stop Godzilla. And like maybe he's devoted to that idea. And the guy that's his coworker tells him, don't you dare go off and just kill yourself pointlessly and leave that baby, Akiko, the baby, I will, there's a reason he mentions the baby there at that point, but he says, I'm not going to let you do that or something. He's upset about that. This idea you've got obligations as a man. You can't just decide to, it's not that sacrificing is wrong, and we'll get to that. I'd like to talk about that. But in this character, the characters, they're not just fleshed out, and it's Japan, and yet honestly, they're doing a better job than most American movies and the American characters at displaying, I would say, actual biblical values that we care about and the way a family should be.
What was the other thing you said? Because there was a second event in the movie that you related to me that made me really did correlate with what my sense of what had happened through the history podcast. Japan's like truly questioning what they had done in World War II and how they were going to go forward, and it was something about they were preparing for some action, and somebody was along the lines of let's prepare to die.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So this is getting towards the movie's climax, and the now large monster because of the testing at the Bikini Atoll, actually the U.S. testing, and the movie works hard to make sure you know why the Americans can't help, because the Soviets are nervous about any American military movement. And so when there's this creature that's a problem for Japan, I think they actually have an actor doing the voice of MacArthur saying, look, we can't help, we're kind of bound, but do what you need to protect yourselves. Well, they put together a plan. The scientist, his name is Noda, and he works with he said, look, we don't have a military anymore. We have the civilians. We have all of us, and we need to put together a plan to try to save our homes and to save our people from this threat. And it's interesting because you have an ex-Navy officer first who they gather all the people together and explain the plan, and he tells them, he said, look, I'm not going to order you. We're past all of that. All I can do is present the concern, and you have to make a choice, and I'll respect that choice, whatever it is. And some of them say, look, it's just too risky, and I have a family, and I can't, And so those men decide, and the one guy who stays speaks up and says, well, are you saying that it's a matter of instant death, guaranteed death? And the scientist says, no, hope not. And he goes, oh, Well, it's already better than the war then. So yeah, it's a nice moment of levity.
Man, that is so true.
But then the night before, they have their plan, and it's not about weapons and stuff. They're having to be smart because they don't have a military anymore, right? So they have the plan that I won't bother to go into detail, but it involves these 2 ships, and it's clearly risky. They know it's risky, and so as they're talking about it, it's going to have to be the next morning. And the scientist tells them all. He says, "Look, we have to be ready at 8:00 or whatever it is, but go home to your families tonight." And one of the men, one of the, I'd say extras, but not really, these, even though they're all nameless, a lot of these guys are nameless, but they're not faceless, they're people. And the movie has had you think of them as people, which I think is important, which we'll talk a little bit more in a minute. But one of them asks, he says, you mean to prepare, as in like go home to, the implication is to prepare to die. Like we're all like, this is going to be a suicide mission the next day. And yeah, the scientist, I think there's a bit of a pause, and he says, no, I don't, we've had enough of death. We've had enough. And he goes into the approach of Imperial Japan there at the end. And he talks about not only the kamikaze pilots, but even their other planes not even bothering to put ejection seats into them, maybe to keep them lighter or save money. He talks about the starvation that became necessary, the things they began to do that just devalued life. And they all know that it's a risky mission, that literally all of them might die. But he says at the same time, that's not the victory we're hoping for. Mm-hmm. He goes, what would be a glorious victory? The most glorious victory in this is if we all come home alive and successful. And so he says, no, go home, be with your families, but we want to live, we're trying to live. And it was a fantastic moment. But what I didn't have at that time was your perspective that you highlighted to me about what was the mentality at that time, and which you've highlighted already. And I thought it really was, and I think since then I've seen other commenters point, it was like a reckoning with the sins of Japan at that time, the mentality they had gotten into.
Yeah, there's a couple things when you related that to me that reminded me of that history podcast, and a couple of like conclusions that I had in my brain. And you rein me in, Mr. Smith, because I might be taking both of these a little far. But the first one was the podcast really does highlight this. There seemed to be a genuine, if we can just view the those who survived, those who were alive in Japan at the end of World War II, after everything had happened, there seemed to be generally a collective evaluation of what had happened, and wait, why did we do that? And how did it turn out? And who do we want to be going forward? And so they actually evaluated themselves nationally. And so I use terms like, it was sort of like they did an examination of their national sins. And, we don't mean this so much biblically, the definition of sin.
Right. I would say more the broader sense, which will actually, I will say, does God honor human life? Let me add this. It's actually a biblical thing. We know from Genesis chapter 1 and verse 27, God made man in his own image. When he says in Genesis 9:6, why is the penalty for murder death and execution? God says, because man is made in my image. That is something sacred. Human life is something that is valuable and that is precious. And I would say, yes, any culture that starts to see human life as something expendable, like the abortion industry now, where the human life in the womb, it's just a wart. It's a clump of cells. In fact, frankly, even if it is a baby, what's more important is the woman's life to decide her own life. Right. Any culture that starts to devalue what God made in human life, a picture of himself, and treat that as worthless, that is a sinful culture. Yeah. And so I would say, based on your description, that Japan had started to think of life as something they could just throw away.
Japan...
We don't mean every Japanese, but the culture, the Imperial Japan culture.
Before the end of World War II, the identity of Japan was Imperial Japan. I mean, that was a very important thing. And Imperial Japan did not value life. And you were expected to make every sacrifice necessary for Imperial Japan, including your life, which the only value it had was in a sacrificial service. Like, say, the kamikazes more very literally, you sacrifice your entire life. Death. It did not... I think even more broadly... that'll be a distraction. But I'm stunned sometimes by certain cultures not even just the Imperial Japan, but like others that don't seem to have much value to life, like life is cheap,
Right.
kind of mentality.
Right.
And in the aftermath of World War II, again, Japan collectively as a nation was like, was that worth it? Was that an actual noble sacrifice? Because your movie seems to have the idea of a sacrifice still very much in it, but like, let's actually have it be for a purpose to preserve life, And so they nationally evaluated their sins as they viewed them from World War II, and really did make a conscious effort that they were going to move away from that and have a different identity. And I would argue now we have 80 years of history of Japan, and you can't even imagine that there used to be an Imperial Japan, because they're so organized, relatively peaceful. People comment all the time when they go tour through Japan. They're like, I can't believe how clean and orderly everything is. There's like no crime. You're not. I know there's crime, but you don't. It doesn't seem to be a lot of crime, and you feel safe. And so anyway, so I found it like fascinating that they culturally evaluated their sins and actually kind of repented of sort of that idea, if we can use, repent in its most literal meaning of to turn away from. They turned away from the ideology of Imperial Japan. And what that reminded me of was, so they're not the only ones that have occasionally reevaluated their national direction and identity. Jesus Christ really, in some of his more scathing indictments of like Israel broadly, does this a couple times. So if I can, so here I'll do one, and then I do have a second one I'd like to read at some point, but maybe we could talk about it. So Jesus Christ in Matthew 12 verse 41, and he is in really indicting the Israel, those remaining of the tribes of Israel, and primarily Judah, because they were the largest group there. So there's Christ. He's preaching. He's teaching, and he's, John the Baptist has preceded him, calling for national repentance. But there's very little movement towards true repentance, and there's actually a resistance, like a lack of faith and a resistance towards Christ's message. So he says in Matthew 12:41, the men of Nineveh will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. Indeed a greater than Jonah is here. The queen of the south will rise up in the judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. So that reminded me of that it's not hard to make the case that the most stubborn human beings ever in the history of the world is Israelite descendants, whereas other nations at a certain point, they're like, hey, maybe this isn't a good idea. we should change the direction.
It's funny you say that, because the Charlotte Bible study this month, and it's my turn to do the Bible study, and we've been going through Isaiah. I'm doing the latter part of Isaiah. Mr. Jonathan McNair and Mr. Dexter Wakefield did the first two thirds. So I'm on the last part, and there's one point where God describes Israel as their neck having sinews of iron. And you think, oh yeah, that sounds tough. Well, no, what that means, you're unwilling to turn your head. You are fixed in one direction to the point that your sinews aren't even flexible at all. They're like made of iron. And it's like, that is the ultimate stiff neck, is that you have an iron neck. And that's exactly right. That's what it's nice to see in this movie, that they're willing, that it's an example of the reckoning that they had with that culture. And you keep waiting for us to have a similar reckoning. We have more and more evidence it's mounting that, for instance, what we're doing with children who they're too young to get a tattoo, but they're not too young to decide that maybe they need to have their bodies mutilated and turned into some other, an imitation of another gender. And you keep thinking, okay, there's got to be a point where there's a reckoning, where we have to look at this and say, this is monstrous, and what are we doing? And then you keep seeing the people driving and just doubling down on it over and over and over again. And it seems maybe it's the special quality of Israel that we have to actually have God, bring the hammer until we actually do see the things we need to. So
the other observation I had, and it was truly more of a wonder, because when I express what it is, you'll understand why it's kind of a maybe. And you comment on whether I've gone too far. So one of the things that was fascinating to me, because also last year I was working on the sermon that I gave a couple times. I gave it at Trumpets and then another time, but it was the Day of the Lord, and we did a podcast on that. Why is the Day of the Lord? Because it's a lot of people die, and it's very bloody, and like, why does it have to be that way?
Right. Why is the Day of the Lord so extra? That was our really hip title.
Yes. Sorry. So what was interesting is that the longer this podcast went on about Imperial Japan, and then the aftermath, where you genuinely start feeling sympathy for the civilians in particular who were left. And so I found myself being really pulled in and starting to view things from more of a Japanese perspective. And so if I'm invested in Japan as a nation moving on from World War II and being its most successful, well then ironically, this is my controversial conclusion. In some ways, one of the best things that happened to them is all the hardcore adherents to Imperial Japan, who believed you needed to sacrifice everything, including your life, for Imperial Japan, did that and died. And it made it easier for Japan, because so many of the hardcore people were no longer around, that those who were left, who were a little more reflected on what they had done and was this such a great idea, were like concluded essentially, no, let's move on from that. And so I would argue that it benefited Japan going forward for its most hardcore people who were influenced by a bad ideology to die. I know that's brutal, but that's what it felt like with the Day of the Lord. Like when you really study what's going on, there's a winnowing at work, which means you're separating what's worthless, the chaff, from what has value, the grain. And so for Christ to come and return and want to work with what's left of humanity, it appears a big part of what he's doing is filtering out all the people that are going to be a problem, like that will not repent. Because you go through those, when you go through the final 7 bowl judgments, and the plagues are bad, I think 4 out of the 7, something like that, it has a conclusion, which is, and they still did not repent.
That's exactly what I was thinking. It talks about how they still didn't repent of their sorceries and their adulteries and their that even when it's become as plain as God could make it in this universe or any universe, this is happening to you because you are sinful, and you will not repent. And it says they still did not repent.
Okay. Then let me read my other scripture.
All right, go.
This will be my last one. Okay, Luke 10, 8, verse 16. This dovetails off, I believe, nicely what you just said. So what we have, the context here is this is some instructions that Christ is giving to the 70 that he sent out. Go out. So in Luke 10, and I'll read verses 8 through 16, they're instructed, whatever city you enter and they receive you, eat such things as are set before you, and heal the sick there, and say to them, the kingdom of God has come near to you. But whatever city you enter, and they do not receive you, go out into its streets, and say, the very dust of your city which clings to us, we wipe off against you. Nevertheless, know this, that the kingdom of God has come near to you. But I say to you that it will be more tolerable in that day for Sodom than for that city. Woe to you, Chorazin! Woe to you, Bethsaida! These are towns or cities in Judea. For if the mighty works which were done in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago, sitting in sackcloth and ashes. But it will be more tolerable for Tyre and Sidon at the judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, who are exalted to heaven, will be brought down to Hades. He who hears you hears me. He who rejects you rejects me. And he who rejects me rejects him who sent me.
Wow.
That's like that all the way back to the top. What are you really rejecting? God. You're not willing to accept God ruling over you. And it's more extreme valuation of that idea. So anyway, I thought that was fascinating, and I'm glad that you wanted to talk about this. At first, you when you brought it up, I was like, what's our point? but when you talked about what they cover and the themes that they cover, and I was like, oh yes, that could be interesting if we.
Well, thanks. Because part of why I want to talk about the 2 Godzillas, if you will, because I'm not against spectacle. It's part of what movies provide. What people look to see for in a great ball game sometimes is a lot of skill and spectacle on display, right?
Yep.
And we're not trying to say that everything has to have deep and profound meaning. If someone hits a home run, you don't have to turn to your friend and say, well, what are the biblical principles that really impact, something like this. That's not what we're trying to say. What we're trying to say is keep your Bible brain on. And when it comes to these Godzilla movies, for instance, because I like the big spectacle of a giant monkey fighting a giant lizard. Well, I do try to keep, like, I did keep in mind, like when I did see that movie, and they're fighting in Hong Kong, which is interesting. Some other reviewer pointed out that because China is such a big source of money for movies these days, and they want to sell tickets, the China government doesn't like you seeing China destroyed. In fact, if there's scenes that show a lot of destruction in China, there's at least, I know some movies they've pushed it back and saying, okay, we don't want this scene in the movie. Yeah. They sure don't mind Hong Kong getting destroyed,
Yeah,
So
could you go blow up Hong Kong instead?
That's right. So sure enough, where does giant monkey and big lizard fight? They fight in Hong Kong.
Next to the
and here you have what would essentially be like a 9/11 kind of event in Hong Kong. You'd have massive death and destruction. And I find it's not like I didn't still enjoy this, because deep down I know what it is. It's a bunch of computer graphics is what it is. And yet at the same time, I couldn't help but think, man, what a bad day for a whole bunch of people. We have to have our biblical brain on, because movies can train us to not think that much of disasters, to not think that much, because why? It's humanity being treated like props. And here you have, after this movie, my sons and I saw it, and we're coming home, and we're talking about the human stories. We're talking about the moral and emotional turmoil and conflict that people were going through. And the humans were what made the story. And it was a reminder that all sacrifice is personal, and all suffering is personal. It'd be one thing if the camera had just shown like the movie 2012, right? And you see this vast destruction and cities being thrown into the sea. Then you got a movie like this, like whenever Godzilla does finally show up on land, and I think it's the city's name is Ginzu, I think, and in this movie, the Godzilla Minus One movie, in a sense, he's smaller. He's more like the size he was in the 1954 movie. But honestly, the devastation felt that much more personal. It wasn't like a whole country or the entire. It just felt like there were people that were suffering, and it meant something. I'm not saying it meant something. It was fictional, but in that sense, it was a reminder that. And then you saw these characters, I know I'm jumping around, but you saw these characters grow. You saw them wrestle with their personal moral dilemmas and the concern that their values were in contradiction. And you saw them work through that. You saw characters overcome bitterness. There was a scene at the end I was trying to explain to my wife, and I was starting to get choked up. I actually had a hard time talking about it than I did seeing it, because it was this side character. Of all things, it was a side character. And yet, clearly the side character had come to a better moral place where life meant something to him that it didn't mean before. And it made me reflect, of all things, not just like, for instance, one thing I like about movies that help remind me that even massive deaths are never just statistics. It's just a lot of individual people who suffered. Yeah. Because it reminds me when God says in Matthew that, if a sparrow falls, God knows about it. That's a sparrow, one of the smallest birds, inconsequential it might seem. And yet if a sparrow falls to the ground, Jesus tells us in Matthew chapter 10 that God knows, God takes notice of that. And he reminds us all, aren't you worth more than sparrows? Not only you're worth more, God actually cares about you so much. He knows how many hairs are on your head. And like someone said recently, it might have been Mr. Weston, and for most of us, that keeps changing every day. He's got to keep track. And so the movie, what I liked about it is it was still in a sense a disaster movie, if you will. And yet it reminded you that disasters aren't just a bunch of statistics. They're all people God cares about. But then finally, the ultimate thing is it made me think of self-sacrifice again, because the movie, in this case, you might think it's against sacrifice. The speech that the scientist Noda gives, like, no, this isn't about death. This is about living. We want to live. The best result that could be if we all come back alive. And you have the character who's upset that he failed in his duty as a kamikaze pilot, and how his arc is going. Like, he is going to sacrifice himself, he says, to stop Godzilla. And it seems like it's anti-sacrifice. And then you realize it's not anti-sacrifice. The people on the boats, they didn't know they were going to come back. They wanted to come back, and they were going to fight to come back, but they didn't know they were going to come back. And so it brings two verses to mind that, and maybe this ties in with so many of those things. Maybe we'll wrap up. The first is John 15 and verse 13, because Jesus highlights sacrifice as one of the highest forms of love and service. And in John 15 and verse 13, he says, greater love has no one than this, than to lay down one's life for his friends. Now, of course, he had in mind the sacrifice that he was going to be giving really just the next day. This is, it's the next day. It's Passover. And this movie, and reflecting, this is the part we're talking about, be willing to think about things biblically. Yes, it was a Godzilla movie, but it's made me think about Christ's statement here in John chapter 15 and verse 13, and what's different between that and the attitude of the protagonist in various places in this movie is because the sacrifice of your own life doesn't mean anything unless you believe life is worth living. If you find your life has no meaning, like the protagonist of the movie, he comes to see nothing of value in his life. He's just in a low point. And the sacrifice of a life where you feel like you have no value at all, you don't even see how God values you, you're, in a sense, you're giving up nothing, right? It's like, what difference does it make if you live or die? When Christ is talking about understanding what it means to lay down your life for your friends, you're not talking about making a meaningless sacrifice. You're talking about being willing, because actually the other verse I wanted to turn to, it's also John, but in this case it's John himself, not just quoting Christ. It's in 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16, because I say this a lot, but this is a good example of it. In 1 John chapter 3 and verse 16, he says, by this we know love, because speaking of Christ, he laid down his life for us, and we also ought to lay down our lives for the brethren. Well, here he's not just talking about death. That's what's really important. He's not just talking about dying for people. Yes, Christ died for us, but the fullness of his sacrifice wasn't just his death. It was that he lived for 33 and a half years for the sake of being our Savior. He laid down his life every day and choosing righteousness over sin and choosing service over just serving himself. And it's highlighted, that's not just an idea. John makes it plain, because John isn't just saying, we know love because he was willing to die for us and we got to die for everybody else, our brethren. He's saying, no, this is what you do. You lay down your life. He gives examples starting in verse 17, making sure your brother has his needs taken care of, actually loving in your actions and not just in your words. And so it's not just about dying, it's about living. And so what the movie is not anti-sacrifice. In fact, I won't go into all the details, but there's various places where people do make sacrifices, where they potentially die, or they're willing to show they're willing to die, but it's not because life is meaningless. That's the thing. You don't fully appreciate what it means to sacrifice yourself, whether it's through death or whether it's by sacrificing yourself every day, by being a living sacrifice, as it says in Romans chapter 12, until you understand the value of life. And the value of life is not in so many of the things that the world wants to say it's in. It's in the fact that you're made in God's image, that the best thing you can give is yourself, this thing that's made in God's image, and devote it to the life and service of others. And so here, I guess here's the meta point. When we're reading God's word, when we're in the culture of God that he's trying to give us, then yeah, you can even go to the movies and watch something that you might think is going to be a popcorn experience, and then hopefully come out thinking worthwhile thoughts. Yep. Not just shoving the pop, which we did shove some popcorn into our faces in the movie. I'm on a diet, so I didn't shove as much as I normally would. But then we came and part of being able to think biblical thoughts after a movie is to have taken the time to equip yourselves with them from the beginning. Going back to the question you addressed earlier in the podcast, Mr. Robinson, how do you start doing that? One of the best things to do to start is just making sure you have material to work with. Take the time to start reading your Bible. Pay attention in services. Take notes, and seeds will land. And then let God create these environments where it's very natural to talk about them. But you've got to start by being equipped with them. And that's it. That's we didn't really mean this to be a movie review so much. We're just trying to model how to think about things biblically. And so, yes, if you're biblically minded, then whether it's a nice, deep, and profound conversation with your friend, or you're just going to watch a movie where a big lizard causes a lot of trouble, you find that you can still think biblically.
Smith and Robinson.